Hello everyone, it's Lumen, and with me today I've got a super special guest. This is Riley, also known as Graey.
Hello.
On Play Agricola, Board Game Arena, probably other places as well. You know him as one of the best players in the world. And yeah, thanks for inviting me to your place in parts unknown in southern Nevada.
Oh yeah, of course.
And yeah, looking forward to doing a few videos with you here. Glad we can make it happen. So this video is, as you probably saw by the title, is part of our top 10 Ox in the new E-Deck for the revised edition of the game. And you should trust us because this E-Deck is based on the G4, G5 decks from Play Agricola, which have been active on Play Agricola for years and years, and we have hundreds, if not thousands of games with, I think we both have thousands of games with this deck.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. I've been playing it since 2016.
Yeah, I've been playing it for probably 5 years now.
Yeah, so you should trust us. Hopefully you do, and hopefully you can take a thing or two away from our rating of these cards and why we say they're good.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think these cards are really exciting. G4, G5 is one of the better, if not probably top 2 decks, in my opinion. And I think these cards are on another level than some of the cards we see in it revised in terms of interesting design, the complex things you can do with them, and just what they add to the game.
Yes, these are fan-made cards in the same vein as the WM and France decks and G decks in the original game. And these decks, you know, to give even more color on it, it wasn't ever certain that these cards would ever get published. So it's hugely exciting for those of us who've been playing for a long time.
Yeah, really great to see.
Yeah. Some of these cards do have new names. We'll bring those up for those in the Play Agricola crowd so you can, you know, familiarize yourself faster. And yeah, I think we can start right off with our honorable mentions. We actually had a hard time cutting this list down to 10.
I think our original was like 15 or 16 Ox.
Yep, and we did some reordering, we did some cutting, and we decided there's still a couple of these outside the top 10 that we need to talk about. The first of those is Field Doctor. Field Doctor is a card that lets you grow without your first room, but it forces you to never build a room. On the other hand, this card is great because it's something that allows you to get your farming started super early. Not just with crops because you have all these fields, but also fences because you're not spending 5 wood on a room and you get to fence faster and just in general have so much better farming tempo.
Yeah, I think the best way to think about Field Doctor is if you take Seducer and make it actually good. Field Doctor is a card that it's similar to Big Country. It allows you to focus on farming early and give you a big payoff for that. Obviously not on the power level of Big Country, but it has a lot of similar play patterns. Obviously the farm is going to look pretty similar if you're plowing around the house, but then instead of getting a huge amount of points, you're getting extra actions, and you have all those fields to start with, so you can do things like sow crops. You have that point threshold of those 8 free points compared to having just a wooden room there. And a lot of games are games, even when you're building rooms, where you stick at 3 rooms, and if you're in a game like that, Field Doctor is just a better way of doing that. And
Absolutely.
Yeah, the main thing you're going to want to look out for with Field Doctor is very similar to Big Country. You're going to want to look for bonus points and ways to find those last grows. So things like Sleeping Corner.
Sheep Rug.
Yeah, Sheep Rug, the new version of Sleeping Corner in this deck. And then bonus points because you're going to have problems of point ceiling because you're just plowing. You get no points for your house other than maybe 2 or 4 points from 2 clay rooms, and that's pretty inefficient. So other ways to get those points is the main thing you're going to want to look out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also not only wanted to highlight this card for its strengths and cool playstyles, but also so that when you see for the first time someone plowing 4 fields around their house, you know actually what it means. They have an occupation incoming with room.
Yeah, if somebody plows all those fields and then start players in round 5, it's not because they're trying to troll your first room and giving somebody else the grow, it's because they are going to grow in front of you. So if somebody is plowing that aggressively, you're going to want to prioritize start player if you have the first room, because otherwise your growth is going to get swept, and sometimes you get jumped all the way back to growing last. So it's a disaster you're definitely going to want to be on the lookout for and try to prevent.
Yeah, exactly. Our other honorable mention occupation here is the stallwright. In the original game, this was known as Engineering Apprentice, and we like free stables, so we like stallwright.
Yeah.
What's really great about it is you can play it as your second dock and immediately get a free stable, and then your next dock also comes with the stable. This enables a lot of early breeding pair combinations, which is another thing we really like. We don't rate it as highly as it was valued in the original game. Like in the original, we were talking about how it would often show up super high in the power lists.
Yeah, Engineering Apprentice was one of the premier cards in this deck in the original, but we think it's going to fall off a bit in power level. For the main reason, the biggest reason, is you don't want to play 7 Ox as much in Revised, because the bottom of the barrel Ox, those cards you're going to be seeing in your last packs, are a lot worse in Revised than in the Play Agricola format. I mean, we could go through the laundry list of all the cards you never want to play.
Yeah. I meant to mention this earlier when we were talking, but that might be slightly a function of us usually playing Draft 8.
That's also true. Agricola. The arena format on Play Agricola, on Board Game Arena, makes it a bit harder to get to 7 Ox that you want to play. And then the other thing with Engineering Apprentice is that the stables, their value is a bit lower in Revised, where sometimes it's pretty easy for people to build out 4 stables. Some games just have a crazy amount of wood if somebody's going crazy with a tree guarder, or there's the forest and all these cards that add a billion wood, whereas in the old version, wood was pretty much always relatively tight. So those make engineering a little bit worse than it was previously, but considering it was one of the top probably 3 Ox in this deck before, it's still going to be a strong card that you're going to want to take.
And maybe we're underrating it. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, maybe we'll be wrong. That's never happened before, so it'd be a first. But who knows?
And then just to further clarify the point, if you're playing Draft 10, this is like...
Yeah, so in the current format where people are drafting 10 to see all the new cards, this becomes a lot better.
Yeah. All right, so we're done with our honorable mentions, but occupation number 10 is very similar to Stallwright. It is Lazy Bones. Lazy Bones, at first, you might see it and think, oh, wow, I just got 4 free stables, woohoo! What me and Riley are thinking right now is that often you won't get 4 stables. I think we think too often you'll end up with 3 stables because maybe everyone has a grain source that isn't grain seeds, or there's just no day labor combo, and with the additional food in Revised in general, if there's no day labor combo, that spot's not going to get taken.
Yeah, there's not 0 day labor cards being added in this deck, but I think it's pretty safe to say that there's 0 good day labor cards being added in this deck. So just on that alone, it's going to happen less where people are really hitting that day labor button, and that makes this worse. And then something to look out for is not being able to build that 4th stable, because it'll be on the space, so you're never going to be able to build it. Can be a disadvantage in Revised when there's cards like Animal Activist and Ranch Pros out there. So that's something you need to watch out for with this card.
Yeah. You can be really cute, though, when you play it. You don't actually have to put your 4th stable out.
That is something to keep in mind. So if you've seen something like Animal Activist, you might want to consider doing that. Because obviously if Animal Activist is in the game, 3 free stables is still a good card.
Right.
But you don't want to put yourself in a position to never be able to get those 3 points. And then I think the main thing to look out for with this card is if you're passing something like Excavator, this card jumps up a lot in power level. It's a pretty easy first pick in a lot of situations, because obviously a lot of the time somebody's going to be taking day labor. If you're passing Assistant Tiller for whatever reason and not taking the tiller yourself, it becomes better. Yeah. But cards like Clay Pit, I mean, any day labor card that you're pretty sure is going to get played makes Lazy Bone jump up a lot, because then it gets pretty close to 4 guaranteed stables. We assume the grain space is going to get taken in most games. You will see occasional games where it doesn't, and this card is only 2 stables. But even then, this card, like Stallright, it's pretty easy to get those 2 stables very early with this card because somebody's always going to be building, and then people a lot of the time will plow relatively early, and they'll always plow at some point in the game, and so that gives this card a very high floor.
Yeah.
And so
2 early stables is like a fine occupation.
Yeah. It's pretty free to play in a lot of situations. It's very comparable, along with Stallright, to Stable Planner, but what you see is Stable Planner, in order to get 2 stables to hold a breeding pair, by stage 2, you have to play it in round 1, which in Revised is very not dependable to get. To get an Ock in round 1, whereas both of these cards, it's much more forgiving. You can play either of them much later in stage 1, or sometimes even in stage 2, and still get that breeding pair in stage 2. And that's what makes them probably a little bit of a cut above Stable Planner, which is already a very solid card.
Right.
The next card to talk about is Beneficiary, or
sorry, we need to cover one quick thing for the original edition. Lazy Bones players. It was called Part-Time Builder, and if you're familiar with it from that set, you should probably have noticed already, but this version is a lot less restrictive. You no longer, like in the original edition, you couldn't take the spaces that you had put a stable on until you got that stable.
Yeah, so it's a pretty significant change and significant buff, because you're not locking yourself out of building your room, most significantly.
So go ahead and enjoy the added benefits if you're familiar with the old one.
Yeah, the change in name I think will help with that a bit, but if you're like, oh, that's Part-Time Builder, no, this card is not Part-Time Builder. It will play out a lot differently.
Yeah. All right, go back. Beneficiary.
The next card we've had on this list is Beneficiary, or if you played on Play Agricola, the card is known as Cheapskate. And if you first look at this card, you might think it seems kind of meager. Seems like, sure, that's a nice card, but it's not that amazing. But Beneficiary, playing an Ock and a Miner, it turns out to be pretty incredible in a lot of situations. If you compare it to some cards that we already know to be solid, like Task Artisan and Tree Farm Joiner, in a lot of situations, playing an Ock can be much more powerful than playing a Miner. Obviously, some games, Task Artisan is going to lock you out of miners. You're just going to have an empty hand, and later in the game, you're not going to be start playing as efficiently, whereas you're never really going to have a situation where you're like, oh, I'm out of all my Ox, and I needed to play more Ox. I mean, if you played 7 Ox, you played 7 Ox.
Right.
And Beneficiary also has the upside of being a premium card in certain strategies, in addition to just being an efficient card as a floor. Cards like Tutor, obviously, it becomes a lot better. Furniture Maker, these old cards that we knew, is still a solid card, and there's some new cards being added that Beneficiary is absolutely premium with.
Yeah, notably there's 2 4-occupation prerequisite miners in the new deck that we'll talk about in an upcoming video.
Yeah, they might show up.
Yeah. And these are both very strong miners. Obviously, it's also great to play your 3-oc prereq miners, like I imagine, because Woodcart's an original card. I think we probably both played this with Woodcart a couple times.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to something like Woodcart or Task Artisan with Woodcart, where you really get it accelerated out quicker because you don't have to take both the occupation space and the start player space. And then some cards like Bookshelf, or if you delay a bookcase for whatever reason, you get to immediately trigger that ability, which is obviously great. A couple things to note. First, you should be able to play the Ock and the Miner in any order. It might be slightly different in the current implementation, but hopefully they'll eventually get that straightened out to where you can choose the order, which definitely matters for cards like Bookshelf, as I mentioned earlier. And then the very important thing that you should notice if you read carefully, but I'm sure we'll see some people run into the issue, if you do not play this as exactly your 3rd Ock, it does nothing. So if you're playing it as your 4th Ock and you're like, oh, I already have 3 Ocks in front of me, it should trigger. Nope, the card will do nothing. It has to be Ock number 3. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure you're carefully reading these new cards because some of them will get you, and this is one of those cards.
Yeah. All right, the next one we want to talk about, our number 8 Ock, is Overachiever. We didn't put numbers next to it on our list because we're fun like that. Overachiever is an awesome card that you can kind of compare to Furnisher, in that when you're doing something that helps you grow, you get to build a major or minor improvement saving a resource. In a lot of games, Overachiever can be better than Furnisher. Notably, Overachiever works on urgent wish for children, so you can still grow with an improvement in the late game. And I think, in my experience with it, you can often get a major improvement pretty late with it.
Yeah. A lot of the time, it's not going to be a premium major usually, but a lot of the time you'll still be able to buy Stone Oven at that point, or worst case scenario, you can build one of the cooking improvements, and if you have a game where you didn't already have a cooking implement, that can shore up your feeding in the last 2 harvests. And so Overachiever definitely turns out to be a powerful card. It's like Furnisher, but it removes the fail state of the 3-room Furnisher game. The one comparison to Furnisher is Furnisher accelerates you towards that first room, which makes it very easy to get down, whereas Overachiever, you really have to make sure you're getting down in time, because if you're just delaying it and you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to be able to play this before I grow, you'll find that it comes up a lot where you missed that first improvement because you didn't take the time. Maybe a Ock got blocked, maybe you missed something and had to start player in a spot you didn't, and you're missing out on a lot of the power of this card, so you really got to be careful. Sometimes it's going to mean playing this card in stage 1, even if you're not using it until round 6, but most of the time it just means carefully think out your actions and make sure you get this down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because I probably would have forgotten, like, how urgent it needs to be sometimes.
Oh, I've definitely missed my fair share of Overachiever procs.
Yeah, I have too, but it took you saying it to remind me.
Yeah.
But with occupations being more contested in the early game sometimes, and revised also.
Yeah, for sure. But there's some very powerful play patterns that this card gives you, in addition to just being a very efficient card. Obviously, we know how efficient Furnisher is. This card can also save you stone or reed, or if you needed that one clay. Yeah.
So, resource is the word on Overachiever, and resource actually includes crops. So all those minor improvements that cost a crop or more, like wholesale market, you can save a whole veggie.
Yeah.
With this card. So, it has some really cool niche combos.
So be on the lookout for that. But in terms of like more normal play, I think some things to be on the lookout for with this card is if you take 2 Reedstone foods for your first room, this card will give you that 3rd stone to build the well, as well as the major action. I think that's probably the most common thing we're going to see from this card, a very powerful play pattern. Obviously, it's very important to be able to secure that well in a lot of games. And then this card also, in those games where there's tons of reed floating around, this card can accelerate you towards the BMW in those games where you're like, oh, BMW is amazing this game. A lot of the time it's hard to grow 1st or 2nd and get that 2 reed and 2 stone. This card shores that up a little bit, where whichever you need the extra stone or the extra reed, this card provides. And then again, it's hard to understate or overstate how powerful just giving you that major action is. And so Overachiever, as long as you take the time to play it and make sure you get it in, can be a very, very powerful card.
Yes. All right.
Yeah. The next cards we're going to talk about somewhat together. They're Omni Farmer and Champion Breeder. If you read them, you can see why we might want to talk about them together. They have some things in common, but they also have some things that can play out pretty differently. So to start with Omni Farmer, Omni Farmer is a card that has very high ceiling in that it can give you 9 points, but you have to be on the watch out for those goods you're giving up. They're not nothing. So similar to Beer Table, I think a lot of people might initially overplay this card by going, oh, I have to get those 9 points. But the power of Omni Farmer is you really don't. We'll see, I think, once people play it more, we'll see a lot more people being comfortable going for 5 to 7 points, because that ends up being a lot more reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that you can play this in round 11 and still get 5 points from it is just so good. And that, for a long time on Play Agricola, was my favorite sweet spot with the card, unless I had something super wild and would go for 9 for the fun of it. it's often better to just aim for a lower number and accept that it's still a really great number of bonus points.
Yeah, in addition to the tempo and amount of game actions you're giving up to start giving away those goods in stage 2, obviously you have to do things like plow and sow and fence and get breeding pairs in stage 2. But if you think about it, you also have to play the Omni Farmer in stage 2 to get those points, which can be a pretty significant drawback. In addition to all those drawbacks, something we see is not all of the goods are as hard to give up as other goods. So obviously you've played plenty of games where that 9th grain is something you just don't need. Some games you have 15 grain that you don't need. And so grain can often be very easy to give away. But some other things I think we're going to see a lot with Omni Farmer is something like that 3rd cow in round 14. Because of the way Omni Farmer works, you can have 2 cows going into that last harvest, and the 3rd cow you breed, you can put on Omni Farmer. And in a normal game, that cow would do nothing. So being able to give it up and put it on Omni Farmer really has 0 cost to you. So things like that end up being very reasonable for Omni Farmer. You see a lot, you're going to have an excess grain on it, that free cow, and then maybe you give up a sheep, and this is a 5-point card. And there's lots of games where a 5-point card is very powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you look at it that way, it really starts to look more and more like free point ceiling.
Yeah, absolutely. The other card, obviously, we mentioned it earlier, is Champion Breeder. And I think when most people look at this, they're immediately going to go, oh, this card is 10 points with Collector. And while that's true, and I'm sure you're going to win tons of games if you ever get both of those cards together, this card is very, very solid without Collector. It ends up being very reasonable to play this card for 4, sometimes 5. Sometimes if you get something like early cattle or a generous flip of cows in round 10, you can get 6 points from this with no other support. But this card has a lot of flexibility and is still very solid in games where you don't have that insane collector game.
Yeah, I mean, even in an underwhelming case, like, you might be able to play this in round 13 for 3 points, 1 breeding pair in stage 5.
Yeah, and
2 rather, and then 3 in stage 6.
Sure, and plenty of games where a late game 3-point Hawk is very solid. And Champion Breeder's real power is that it rewards you for doing something that a lot of the time you already want to be doing. If you're playing a 3-room game, one of the best things to do is fence early and take those breeding pairs because it's an efficient way to get points. And so, obviously, if you're in that situation, Champion Breeder gives you points for something you already want to be doing. And that's always something you want to look out for in Agricola, because essentially free points where you don't really have to give up a lot is very powerful.
Yeah, and to emphasize that, the play pattern for Champion Breeder is something I think many of us are very familiar with, and just fits in very nicely. It's just 1 extra card you have to play on top of, fencing in normal 15 and putting animals in the fences. Whereas Omni Farmer, the comparable card, you might be tempted to stretch it out and play a completely unfamiliar play pattern, even though hopefully we've convinced you don't necessarily need to do it too differently.
Yeah, and one thing to look out for between these cards, and even in general with Champion Breeder, is a very crucial point in the game for Champion Breeder is getting those cows. So obviously with Champion Breeder, things like early cattle become a lot more appealing because you get the points back for them for very low cost, and Champion Breeder, if you can play it like a stage 2 or 3, early cattle becomes amazing. But even in games where there's no support, Champion Breeder can still be playable, but you have to make sure you get those cows. So again, whether they flip in 10 or 11 is very important, but you have no say in that. The important thing is making sure you get those cows. So regardless of 1 cow's flip, a lot of the time you're just going to have to prioritize taking 1 cow. If you think you can float 2 cows, make sure you start player for them, because if you're planning on playing Champion Breeder and somebody sweeps those cows, it becomes a completely dead card, because then to get 2 cows in stage 12 and 13, or rounds 12 and 13, becomes very tricky. And at that point, a lot of the time, it becomes not worth it to play Champion Breeder at all. So make sure you have a plan to get those 2 cows, because, that's really where you want this card to be for the highest points, is breeding all 3 animals. If you're just breeding sheep and boar for 3 stages, it can be playable, but that's not where you want to be.
Right. All right, I think that's a good place to stop us for Ox 10 through 6 with our honorable mentions. Stay tuned for the more exciting, technically, occupations 5 through 1.
Yeah, we'll get to the juicy ones.
Yep, there's some really fun stuff in there. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment if you think any of our takes are trash. And yeah, we'll see you for the next part.
Yeah,
soon.
see you then.